Principles of Macroeconomics, Chapter 11, the aggregate demand versus the aggregate supply model, Professor Wagner. This chapter pertains to the macroeconomics perspective on demand and supply, builds models of aggregate demand and supply, shifts in aggregate demand, and how the AD/AS model incorporates growth, unemployment, and inflation. Keynes Law will be discussed, and Say's Law in the aggregate demand and supply models. An example would be new home construction. At the peak of the housing bubble, many people across the country were able to secure loans necessary to build new homes. And what you see is a graph of the housing market, the number of new homes sold and created was a general upward curve from 1990 all the way up to about 2006, late 2006, and then the number dropped dramatically, and this decline continued through 2011, and by 2014, number of new homes sold had begun to climb back, and this was a result of the 2008 financial crisis, also known as the Great Recession. So there were many things that were interconnected that fell apart like a house of cards, and that created this sharp decline in the demand for housing because there was a great deal of uncertainty financially here. Macroeconomic perspective on demand and supply. Macroeconomists sometimes divided into two groups, and supply is the most permanent determinant of the size of a macroeconomy, and demand just tags along. Demand is the most important factor in the macroeconomy, while supply just tags along. A successful economic approach needs to take into account both. We'll talk about these philosophies and the people behind them in a few slides down the road. So we have Say's Law and macroeconomics of supply, or you may have heard the term supply sider. And so they postulate or stipulate that supply creates its own demand. Each time a good or service is produced and sold, it represents income to someone. The neoclassic economists generally emphasize the importance of aggregate supply and determine the size of a macroeconomy in the long term. Say's Law says that supply creates its own demand. It does seem a good approximation for the longer run. Over the period of years or decades, productive power of an economy to supply goods and services increases, total demand grows at roughly the same pace. Under shorter time periods of a few months or years, recessions or depressions can occur, which firms as a group seem to face a lack of demand for their products. So we're going to talk about that. Falls into the stickiness of economic dynamics and how they react to changes in one to the other. And then you have Keynes Law and his macroeconomics of demand. So another term you'll hear is Keynesian economics, and he stipulates the demand creates its own supply, meaning that whatever is demanded and how much of it is demanded will, basically induce producers to create the supply to meet that demand. And the level of GDP economy is not primarily determined by the potential of what an economy can supply, but rather the amount of total demand. Keynes Law can apply well in the short run. So this is a short run view of months to years. And however, if the government could make an economy larger through increases of government spending or taxes to push up consumption, this is the main thing that Keynes, likes to talk about in his discussions of macroeconomic demand. saying the government really drives, the economy as opposed to free market forces. Here we have a number of definitions. Probably need to know these for the test. Aggregate demands and supply models, definition of aggregate supply, the curve, potential GDP, and then full-time employment GDPs. So these are specific situations. Need to probably know the preconditions for each. Here on this slide, you see that there's an aggregate supply curve being depicted, where you see a situation where the supply is, has a curve, and let's say at various points, the price level base per year equal 100. So 100 is basically the normal index. At let's say 8,000, $8,000 billion, the real GDP, that would be our price level index. However, if we were up here at 9,500, the price level would be 105, and the real GDP would be $9.6 trillion in that particular. And then the aggregate demand slopes downward, which makes sense. It behaves as all other demand curves. It shows the price level rising and the total amount of spending on domestic goods and services declines. Basically, it's about the consumer having X amount of discretionary dollars to spend on goods and services, and with the notion that the consumer makes rational choices with respect to what are realistic priorities, like, it could be shelter, it could be heating, it could be food on the table. Those sorts of things will come before maybe going to Disney World. Once again, making the assumption that the consumer is rational. Although in real life, we see many instances where this is not true. When you combine aggregate supply and demand curves, what you get is a picture where they actually intercept, and so there is such thing as an equilibrium, and that equilibrium happens at the price level of 90, at the output level of 8,800. So that would be right here. So it behaves as a supply and demand curve, and most other circumstances, we're just talking about the aggregates. So if you use a hypothetical equilibrium at the price of 130, and the real GDP being 680, what information can we infer about the state of this country's economy? And what is the other question is are we risking inflationary pressures or facing high unemployment? How can you tell? Defining short run aggregate supply and long run aggregate supply. The positive short run relationship between price level for output and GDP holding prices of inputs fixed. And then long run is defined with a vertical line of potential GDP showing no relationship between price level of output and real GDP in the long run. Could see these on a test. Two factors that can lead to shifts in the aggregate supply curve, and that's productivity growth and changes in input prices. The supply curve could also shift due to unexpected shocks to input goods or labor. So there may be some black swan event that eliminates a good needed to produce, some other good, or labor going on strike as an example. Large weather events is an example they want to use. War requires a large number of people to fight instead of work. So these are things that can, take away from, normal shifts in the aggregate supply. Stagflation, that's a definition. It's basically where the economy experiences high inflation but very stagnant growth in terms of GDP. 1970s was a good period to describe that. So you have two graphs here referring to GDP versus the price levels. And the left-hand graph shows if productivity growth shifts at the aggregate supply to the right, these would be the different equilibrium points based on each given shift. If it was to move in the opposite direction, you would also see a change in equilibrium. You notice that on the left-hand side, as the long-run supply curve goes to the right, the equilibrium drops at different points, where the opposite is true on the graph on the right. This slide goes into more discussion about the two graphs. Graph B, the higher price for in-goods, means any given price level for outputs, a lower GDP will be produced, so aggregate supply will shift to the left. And so that's illustrated, from here to here. You have that going on there. And so you would have a new equilibrium point with a reduced quantity of output and a higher price than the original equilibrium point, E0. Here, this slide discusses the elements that will change aggregate demands or shifts in them. So consumption, investment, government, spending on exports, minus imports. These are all normal influencers. The shift to the right means at least one of these components increase so that a greater amount of total spending would occur at every price level. And the shift to the left means that one of these components increase, so the lesser amount of the total spending would occur at each price level. Definitions, probably should know that for a test. Changes by consumers and firms can affect aggregate demand. So it's about psychology to some degree. If customers are confident about the future of the economy, they tend to buy more. And so there's constant discussion about consumer confidence. It's an actual index that economists track to project the likely outcome of growth or lack of growth of any given economic circumstance. If business confidence is high, then they'll spend more on investment, believing the future payoff will be substantial. So you can kind of say this is infectious. Success breeds yet more success, and the same goes with confidence. On the flip side, if people lose confidence in the direction of the economy, or will say how robust things are going to remain or not, then you can see declines on the horizon. When taking a look at shifts in aggregate demand, we could take a look at graph A, and the increase in consumer confidence or business confidence can shift the aggregate demand curve to the right from AD to A0, so it would actually shift, from here to there, and there would be a new equilibrium where this is the original. The new equilibrium would be found and along with the short run aggregate supply curve at E1, so the price level would be P1, and the real GDP would be grown upwards. An increase in government spending or tax cuts could also lead to a shift in the AD to the right. So these are various examples of how that could occur. On graph B, we can talk about an increase or actually a decrease in consumer confidence and business confidence, and it shifts it from 80 here back to 81, and where you had an equilibrium at this particular price, we move along the supply curve or short run aggregate supply, and we find a new equilibrium at E1. What causes this? Would be a decrease in government spending or higher taxes. These are typical things that would cause this to occur. Okay, we're going to talk about how government macro policy choices can shift the AD. Higher government will cause it to shift to the right, whereas lower government spending will cause it to shift to the left. Tax cuts will tend to increase consumption demand, while tax increases tend to diminish it. Tax policy also pump up uh, investment demand by offering lower tax rates for corporations or tax reductions that may benefit a particular type of investment. During the recession, unemployment is high. Many businesses are suffering for low profits or even losses. The U.S. often, in response, will pass tax cuts, as we have seen within the last few years. So, also, yeah, talking about long-run supply and aggregate demands, uh, recession and full employment in the ADAS model. So whether your economy is in a recession, illustrated in the ADAS model, how close equilibrium is to the potential GDP line is indicated by the vertical LRAS line there. So that's okay. That's the long run aggregate supply is further away at this point. In this example, the equilibrium E0 is relatively far from the potential GDP line, which is right here. And so this would represent a recession. In contrast, if the level of output at E1 is relatively close to the GDP, so it would represent an economy with a lower unemployment rate. So this would be uh, effectively a little bit of a positive change for the better. How the ADAS model incorporates growth, unemployment, and inflation. These are some relationship axioms. So basically, growth and recession in the ADAS diagram. Long-run economic growth due to productivity increases over time will be represented by a shift to the right of aggregate supply. This will be probably something you see in the test. The vertical line representing the potential GDP or the full employment level of GDP will gradually shift over time as well. The diagram will also illustrate recessions when the equilibrium of level of the real GDP is substantially lower than the potential GDP. In recent of resurgent economic growth, the equilibrium will typically be close to the potential GDP. And that's where we were probably about 6 weeks ago, and that picture is probably shown that the the curve has actually shifted to the left due to higher unemployment. There are two types of unemployment, which is the short-run variation, cyclical, caused by business cycle or as an economy will expand or contract. Long run typically hovers around when the economy is healthy. So the 5% number once again comes up as full employment. Uh, the ADAS diagram shows cyclical unemployment by how close the economy is to the potential or full GDP employment level. Low cyclical unemployment for an economy occurs when the level of output is close to the potential GDP. High cyclical unemployment is when it's to the left of it. Inflationary pressures in the ADAS diagram. Inflation fluctuates in the short run. Higher inflation rates typically have occurred either just after an economic boom or during. Rates of inflation generally decline during recessions. In the ADAS framework, it implies that two ways inflationary pressures may arise. And that is if the aggregate demand continues to shift to the right when the economy is already at or near the potential GDP and full employment, thus pushing the equilibrium into the AS curve steep portion. or a rise in input prices that affect most firms across the economy, such as oil, labor, and causes of aggregate supply shift back to the left. So there's two conditions there. And so in this particular case, we see that a shift in demand from 80.0 shifting to the right to 81. Okay, that's going to show that we're close to the potential GDP, or perhaps even beyond it. This is the potential GDP here, so we've actually moved beyond that. This will lead to higher price level inflation. The new new equilibrium is at a higher price level than the original equilibrium. But since the shift has put the equilibrium to the right of the long range aggregate supply, there'll be inflationary pressures. In continuation on graph B, if the short run supply shifts to the left, the equilibrium here is closer to the GDP, but as it shifts to the left, the new equilibrium is a bit further away, so that would mean the new equilibrium E1 is at a higher price P1, while the original is at the lower price P0. So here we're going to apply Keynes Law or Say's Law on the ADAS model. We can use the ADAS model to illustrate both Say's and Keynes Law. This approach is dividing the SRAS curve into different zones, and it works as a diagnostic test as we can apply to the economy. So basically, it's here. The equilibrium E of K is the Keynesian zone, and that's where the aggregate demand curve is meeting the short run aggregate supply. The intermediate zone, E1, and then the neoclassical zone is when supply, these two, the aggregate demand and the short run aggregate supply actually meet the potential GDP line, which is the long run aggregate supply. To reiterate, Keynesian zone is a portion of the short run aggregate supply curve where the GDP is far below its potential, and the short run aggregate supply curve is flat. And so if the AD curve crosses a portion of the SRAS curve in the Keynesian zone, the equilibrium of the real GDP is far below the potential GDP, so we will be experiencing recession, cyclical unemployment will be high, and inflationary pressure will pretty much be negligible. Okay. In the neoclassical zone, the GDP is pretty much at or near potential, and so this would be cyclical unemployment would be low in this case. The only way to increase the size of the real GDP is for the AES to shift to the right, and shifts in the aggregate demand will create pressures that change the price level. So this will be inflationary. The intermediate zone is basically what's in between the Keynesian and neoclassical zone, and so if a shift to the right, it'll produce closer to potential GDP. It will be a reduction in unemployment, but it also will give a little bit more pressure to inflation. Or if it shifts to the left and further away from it, there'll be rise in unemployment, but there'll be a downward pressure on inflation. This concludes Chapter 11.